The next morning, Vine woke up with a terrible headache. She tried to sit up, but she didn't have the enough strength to get up. Groaning, she dropped her head back, squeezing her eyes shut. She burrowed deeper into the blanket. Suddenly, the flashbacks of last night hit her like a bullet train. Her eyes shot open and she sat upright, holding her head. Shit, what have I done? She cursed herself as the last night's argument replayed in her head, which had shattered everything. She wished she could rewind the time and mend the damage she had done. She wished she could take back the harsh words she had flung on Jungkook, the bitterness she threw at him, but unfortunately there was no point of crying over spilt milk. What happened had already happened. Instead of thinking about it again and again, she needed to make amends for her mistakes. She needed to apologize to Jungkook a million times if that was what it took to gain his forgiveness. How can I do this? She mumbled to herself. The memory made her wince. The room was quiet, too quiet for what used to be the house filled with laughter and morning greetings. She glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. The spot beside her on the bed was cold, empty. He hadn't returned last night. A wave of guilt crashed over her. I'm so sorry, Jungkook. I promise I'll fix things between us, she whispered to herself, tracing her fingers on the cold spot. The emptiness was a straight hit on her heart, a reminder of the damage she had done. Her thoughts were tangled around Jungkook, his pained expression during their argument, the way he had looked at her as if she had torn something fragile between them. Her heart twisted painfully. This isn't how it's supposed to be. I need to fix this. With a sigh, she swung her legs over to the edge of the bed and padded to the bathroom. Descending the stairs, she stepped into the living room. Jungkook was there, seated on the couch with his back to her, his posture relaxed but tense at the same time. His broad shoulders were slumped slightly, his dark hair falling messily over his eyes as he leaned forward, staring down at the steaming cup cradle in his hands. He looked weary. Her heart ached at the sight. Jungkook, she whispered softly, almost afraid to break the silence. He didn't react, his focus still fixed on the dark liquid swirling in his cup. Gathering her courage, Vine took a tentative step forward and then another. The floor creaked under her foot, and his head snapped up at the sound. His eyes locked onto hers. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. His eyes, those beautiful, expressive eyes, held hers in a silent, unreadable stare. There was something there, something raw and vulnerable that made her heart clench painfully. But before she could decipher it, before she could even open her mouth to speak, the stutters came down. His gaze turned cold, distant, and then he looked away, jaw tightening. Her heart sank, feeling rejected by him. Jungkook, But the words died on her lips as he abruptly pushed himself from the couch. The sudden movement made the coffee in his cup slosh dangerously, but he didn't seem to notice. He didn't look at her as he set the cup down on the table with a soft clink and then turned, striding towards the hallway. Wait, please, Jungkook, just... She took a quick step forward, her voice trembling. But he was already walking past her, the distance between them growing wider with each step. The ache in her chest tightened, a dull throbbing pain that threatened to pull her under. She stood there, frozen, watching helplessly as he reached the doorway, his hand pausing on the frame for the briefest of moments. A hope flickered within, but it disappeared when he walked out without glancing back at her. She stood there, staring blankly at the empty space where he had been, her chest tightening with the sharp sting of rejection. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. Not again. I'm sorry, she choked out, her voice a broken whisper in the stillness. It had been 3 days since he had maintained his distance, retreating into a world she could no longer reach. It hurt more than she thought possible. She hadn't just lost his voice, his presence. She had lost his smiles, his teasing remarks, the gentle touches that used to ground her. It was as if the man she loved had vanished, leaving behind a stranger who wore his face. But she couldn't give up, not on him, not on them. This evening she decided to cook his favorite meal, carefully preparing every dish just the way he liked it, hoping he would give her a chance to talk and fix the mess she created. The kitchen was filled with warm, comforting scents, and for a moment she let herself hope. She set the table, lit a few candles, and took a deep breath. It wasn't much, but maybe it would be a start. With a soft sigh, she settled into her chair, resting her chin on her folded arms as she gazed across the table. Please, please just let me talk to you, just once, she murmured quietly, her thoughts occupied with Jungkook. Her eyelids drooped, exhaustion tugging at her. She had been determined to stay awake, but now, as the minutes blurred into hours, the heaviness in her limbs grew impossible to fight. Maybe just a little rest, just a moment to close my eyes, she murmured groggily, sleep claiming her senses, her head slipping down to rest on her arms. Jungkook stepped inside quietly, slipping off his shoes and hanging his jacket on the hook. The house was dark and still, save for the faint flickering glow coming from the kitchen. Frowning, he made his way towards the kitchen. And then he froze. There she was, slumped over the dining table, her hair falling messily around her face. For a moment he just stared, his heart constricting painfully in his chest. A lump formed in his throat as he took in the sight of the lovingly prepared meal and the empty wine glasses waiting to be filled. Slowly Jungkook approached, his footsteps almost soundless on the kitchen tiles. He stopped beside her, staring down at the peaceful lines on her face, softened in his sleep. The sight made his chest tighten. How long had it been since he had looked at her like this? Since he had really seen her? Too long. Gently, almost hesitantly, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair away from her cheek. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but even that small touch sent a jolt through him. She stirred slightly, a soft sigh escaping her lips as she shifted in her sleep, leaning unconsciously towards his touch. Vian, he whispered the name, a rough, aching sound in the silence. She didn't wake, her breathing deep and even. For a long moment he just stood there, his hand hovering near her face, torn between the desire to pull her into his arms and the heavy weight of everything that stood between them. But she looked so small like this, so vulnerable, and despite everything, despite the hurt, the distance, and the lingering bitterness, he couldn't leave her like this. With a quiet sigh, Jungkook leaned down, carefully sliding one arm under her knees and the other around her shoulders. He lifted her effortlessly, cradling her against his chest. She shifted, murmuring something incoherent, and instinctively nuzzled closer to his warmth. His breath caught, his heart stuttering at the familiar, comforting weight of her in his arms. It felt right, so right that it almost made him falter, almost made him forget the pain that still lingered between them like a raw, open wound. But he couldn't forget, not yet. Jaw clenched, Jungkook turned and carried her out of the kitchen, moving silently down the hallway and into their shared bedroom. He lowered her gently onto the soft mattress. Vine stirred again, her eyes fluttering half open as she tucked the blanket around her. Jungkook, she murmured sleepily, her voice soft and confused. He froze, his gaze locking onto hers. For a brief, breathless moment, everything else faded away. It was just them, her half asleep, looking up at him with those wide, pleading eyes, and him caught in the grip of emotions he couldn't name. Go back to sleep, he murmured finally, brushing his thumb lightly against her cheek. She blinked slowly, her eyes drifting shut again, and Jungkook stayed there, watching her until her breathing evened out once more. The tightness in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a dull, aching tenderness. Leaning down, he pressed the faintest of kisses to her forehead, his lips barely brushing her skin. Reluctantly, he straightened, stepping back from the bed. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on her peaceful form, memorizing every line, every shadow. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned and walked quietly out of the room and made his way towards the guest room where he had been sleeping since 3 days. Vaya stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, a woman wrapped in the delicate, crimson lace that barely reached mid-thighs, with a deep neckline that enunciated every curve. It was one of Jungkook's gifts from their early days together, a playful promise of intimacy and desire. She had never worn it until now. Back then, when he had handed her the package with a mischievous smile, he had whispered, "Wear this when you want my undivided attention, sweetheart." Tonight, it wasn't about seduction. It was about desperation, about a last-ditch effort to get him look at her, to see her, to hear her. Maybe this is crazy. She bit her lip as she adjusted the hem nervously, but she was past the point of rationality. A week of silence had torn her apart piece by piece, and she was willing to do anything, anything to break through the wall Jungkook had built around himself. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a thin silk robe and wrapped it loosely around herself, letting it hang open to reveal just enough of the lace and satin to hint at what lay beneath. With one last glance in the mirror, Vian squared her shoulders and stepped out of the bedroom. The muffled sound of voices guided her down the hallway, leading her to his home office. She could hear the low murmur of Jungkook's voice, deep and steady, as he spoke to someone, his tone cool and commanding. It sent a shiver down her spine, stirring something bittersweet in her chest. She missed that voice, missed him. Heart pounding, she hesitated just outside the partially closed door. She knew interrupting his work like this was risky, and especially given her how busy and tense he had been lately. But that didn't matter anymore. She wouldn't keep waiting on the sidelines, watching him slip further and further away. Steeling herself, Vian pushed the door open and stepped inside. Jungkook's head snapped up at the sound, his expression instantly hardening. He was seated behind his large mahogany desk. His men, seated around the table, exchanged furtive looks but said nothing. Even in a room full of armed killers and hardened criminals, her presence in that revealing nighty was more dangerous than any weapon. "Out," she commanded softly, her voice steady. The men hesitated, but a slight nod from Jungkook had them scrambling out, leaving husband and wife alone. "Vian, what are you doing?" he said, his voice low, laced with warning. His eyes darkened as they traced the outline of her form, lingering on the bare skin exposed by the flimsy robe. "I needed to talk to you," she said softly, summoning every ounce of courage she had. She took a step closer, her pulse racing wildly. "But you won't listen. You won't even look at me." Jungkook stood up, his movements fluid and predatory. He rounded the desk, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Vian held her ground, lifting her chin even as her heart hammered in her chest. "What are you doing?" he repeated, his voice strangely soft as he stopped in front of her. He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne, spicy and rich, familiar and intoxicating. "I am trying to get you to talk to me," she whispered, staring up at him. The raw emotion in her voice made his eyes flicker, but his expression remained cold and controlled. "You have been avoiding me for days, Jungkook. I can't take it anymore." His gaze swept over her again, lingering on the exposed skin of her collarbone, the dip of her cleavage barely concealed by the lace. His hands clenched into fists, and when he spoke, his voice was tight. "So you thought dressing like this and interrupting my mating was the way to do that?" Vian swallowed hard, lifting her chin defiantly. "You told me to wear this when I wanted your attention. Well, I want it now. I need it now, Jungkook. I need you." She soared back, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. Something flickered in his eyes, something dark and dangerous and intense. For a moment she thought he might lash out, that his anger might finally break free, but instead he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the thin strap of her nighty. "You don't know what you are asking for. You think this," he gestured to her outfit, his gaze shearing, "is going to fix everything?" "No, but I don't know what else to do. I miss you, Jungkook. I miss us. I know I hurt you and I'm so sorry. Please just talk to me. Yell at me if you want, but don't shut me out like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. His expression twisted, pain flashing across his face before he turned away sharply, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You don't get it, do you? It's not that simple," he growled softly, his back to her. Then make it simple, she pleaded, stepping closer. She reached out, hesitating only for a moment before wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. His muscles tensed under her touch, but he didn't pull away. Please, Jungkook, I'm sorry. I love you. For a long moment, he didn't move. The silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. Then slowly he turned, his gaze piercing as he looked down at her. His hands cupped her face, his touch gentle despite the storm raging in his eyes. You really want to talk? Fine, let's talk. He murmured, his voice dangerously calm and soft. The air between them crackled with intensity as Jungkook held her gaze. One could see the battle raging in his eyes, the pain, the frustration, the anger, and something softer beneath all later. Something raw and wounded, hidden beneath the layer of his stubborn pride. Please, I'm sorry, Jungkook. I really am. I know I was wrong and I know I hurt you. I was stupid, reckless, but I never meant anything I said. Her fingers tightened around his shirt as she looked up at him, desperation etched into every line of her face. I am so sorry. For a moment, Jungkook didn't respond, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until she thought she might break under the weight of it. But then, slowly, his hand slid from her cheeks, moving to cup the back of her neck. His thumb brushed gently over her jawline, a small tender kiss that made her breath hitch. I know you didn't mean to, but it doesn't change the fact that you did. He paused, his gaze searching hers. You have no idea what it did to me to think that I am not good for you, that I am casing you with me. I felt like I failed to love you the way you deserve. His voice broke, and he exhaled sharply, looking away as if the memory still cut too deep. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head quickly, reaching up to grasp his wrist. You didn't fail me, I did, and I'm guilty of that. I need you to forgive me. I need you to love me again the way you used to. Few tears rolled down her cheeks. His gaze snapped back at hers, and something shattered in his expression. A raw, aching sound escaped his lips, and before she could react, he was pulling her closer, his arms wrapping around her tightly as if he couldn't bear to let go. I never stopped loving you, not for a second, he murmured hoarsely, his face buried in her hair. Vian's heart clenched painfully, a sob of relief breaking free as she buried her face against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat thundering under her cheek, strong and steady and real. It was like coming home after a long, cold night, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't felt in so long. I'm so sorry, Jungkook, she whispered again, the words muffled against his chest. His hold on her tightened, his breath hot against her temple as he leaned down, his voice a rough whisper. Don't be sorry anymore. Just don't do that ever again. I won't, I swear I won't, she promised breathlessly, her fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt. For a long moment, they just stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, holding on as if the world might shatter around them if they let go. And then slowly, Jungkook drew back, his gaze intense as he stared down at her. Come here, he murmured, his voice softening as his hands cradled her face once more. Before she could respond, his lips were on hers, gentle at first, almost hesitant. But then she responded, her hands twisting in his shirt, and he deepened the kiss, a low, desperate sound rumbling in his chest. It was a kiss full of everything they had been holding back, all the frustration, the anger, the pain, and the aching, overwhelming love. It consumed her, filling every empty, aching space inside her until there was nothing left but him. The taste of him, the feel of his lips moving against hers, the way his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, closer as if he couldn't get enough. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads pressed together as they stood there, the world spinning around them. I love you so much, Jungkook, Vine whispered softly, her voice trembling with the force of the emotion swelling in her chest. His eyes softened, the hardness melting away as he gazed down at her, and then he smiled, a small, crooked smile that sent warmth flooding through her. I love you too, he whispered, his thumb brushing gently over her cheek, and I forgive you. Relief washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. With a soft tearful laugh, Wyan leaned up and kissed him again, pouring everything she had into it, the promise of a new beginning, the hope that they could rebuild stronger and closer than ever before. But your punishment is still pending. She frowned, her chest tightening, thinking he still hadn't forgiven her. However, a soft mule escaped her lips when he picked her up in a swift move and made her sit on the desk. He parted her thighs and stood in the space between them. "You are not getting off that easily, baby girl," he whispered, nuzzling his face in the crook of her neck. His fingers twisted around the strings, untying the rope. And Ryan knew he would keep his words. She really wasn't getting off that easily, at least not till the dawn.